The sun was shining through the window of the Moffitt family home one afternoon in 2012, but the mood inside was anything but light. Jessica Moffitt was in the home with the intention of keeping her mother company. Her father had unfortunately passed away. It had only been a few years since Jessica's grandmother had died, and the double hit of the two people her mother was closest to passing away had been a huge hit to her. Jessica walked upstairs to find her mother going through her father's belongings. She had just started working through the mountain of objects that had been stuffed in the wardrobe over the years, and wordlessly, Jessica started helping her mother in laying everything out on the floor. It was then that Jessica found a small box. She opened it and discovered photographs. Photos from her childhood, of her mother and father from before she was born, of her grandmother, and also her grandfather, a man she hadn't seen since she was just a small child. But as she was flipping through the photos, she noticed something strange. A photograph of a knife, dug deep into a wall, stabbed through a family photo. The next photo appeared to show a bed destroyed. The next was an image of strange symbols spray painted on a wall. Jessica turned to her mother, Deborah Moffitt, and asked what these were. Deborah's face turned white. She stuttered out loud that she didn't know her husband had kept these. They were from over 20 years ago. Deborah took a deep breath, deciding that it was finally time. She told Jessica that she had been keeping something from her. Something that she will struggle to believe. Something horrible. Jessica sat down on the bed as Deborah prepared herself to tell the story she had sworn decades before never to talk about. There was something with us for a long time, Deborah said. Some people told us it was a ghost or a demon, but we only knew it as the entity. Welcome to the tape library. Tonight we've got a haunting that, I'll be honest, is the first case I've covered in quite a while that genuinely got under my skin. I'm thrilled to say that this episode has once again been brought to you by our sponsors Manta Sleep, but I'll talk about them a little later. Let's get into tonight's story. This is a tale of long-held family secrets, a story of violence, of hate, and potentially, even of murder. Grab yourself a warm drink, dim the lights, and get comfortable. This is the deadly haunting of the Moffitt family. Our story begins around 1984, as Deborah Moffitt met and married Bill Moffitt Jr. While they loved and cared for each other deeply, the early years of their marriage would be difficult to say the least. It's necessary to set the scene a little for the newlyweds' living situation, as it was a little unusual. On Archibald Avenue, not far from Los Angeles, the Moffitt family actually owned 3 homes, all next to one another. Bill Jr. owned one of them, after it had been left to him after the passing of his aunt, but he didn't actually live in this house. Instead, he shared a home with his mother and father, Bill Sr. and Lena, or Lee, as she was most often called. Bill Jr. had a heart condition, something that seemingly ran in the family, as a number of them would eventually lose their lives to heart failure. In the house next to theirs lived Bill Jr.'s grandmother, Dominica, and in the house Bill actually owned, he would later rent it out to a man named Danny. When Deborah and Bill Jr. got married, she moved in with him and her in-laws, and seemingly had a great relationship with both Bill Sr. and Lee. However, shortly before moving in, Dominica would suffer from a stroke. She was in hospital for some time, but once she did finally return home, it quickly became apparent to the family that Dominica would require round-the-clock care. Luckily, a local neighbour and friend of the family offered to come and work for the Moffitts. This was Juanita, a middle-aged woman from Guatemala who had been desperately looking for a new job. She needed employment to continue using her work visa to stay in the US. However, despite the help, Dominica's condition was not improving as hoped. With medicine seemingly not helping the woman, and concern for both her friend and for her own potential future, Juanita decided to take matters into her own hands. Juanita was a practitioner of Santeria, an Afro-Caribbean religion that believes through rituals they are able to contact deities and even have them get involved in human affairs under the right circumstances. However, it would appear that these were not the right circumstances. Dominica would unfortunately pass away, and just 24 hours later, Bill Sr. and Jr. would arrive at Dominica's home to find Juanita there, terrified, acting as if something was after her. The pair calmed her down, but Juanita just kept repeating that she was just trying to help. A family member finally came to pick up Juanita, but before she left, she turned to Lee and told her to stay out of Dominica's house. She claimed that there was something evil in there. When the family finally got round to clearing out Dominica's house, they discovered the remnants of what Juanita's attempts at help had been. They found strange markings carved on the walls, the remains of candles, knives, the broken beads from a rosary, and most disturbing of all, feathers and blood. This may very well mark the start of the strange events that happened to the Moffitt family, but it would be a few years later that the horror fully began. Before we get into that though, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Manta Sleep. Manta Sleep make incredible quality sleep masks that are completely adjustable, giving you complete blackout as you sleep. I've been using these masks for a while and they have drastically improved the quality of my sleep, especially with the pesky summer sun starting to peek in a little earlier and earlier. Just a little additional thing I love about these, they also provide these little scented dots that you can slide into the front of your mask, giving you a nice relaxing aroma to aid you into a restful sleep. So if you want to check them out, you can use the link in the description below, and if you use the code TAPE, you will also get 10% off your order. So thank you once again to Manta Sleep. And now, let's get on with our story. Around 1987, Deborah had now been living with her in-laws for a good few years, and Bill Jr.'s house was now rented out to this man called Danny. There was one condition for Danny living there though. Bill Jr. had a large collection of sports memorabilia, and he needed to have one room left in the house that he could use to store his ever-growing collection. A small inconvenience that Danny had no issue with. Yet despite the pair having a good relationship, Bill was very protective of his collection, and he would always leave the room locked. One day Bill and his father went over to the house to take a look at the collection. He unlocked the door as usual, but discovered something unusual when he entered. The bobbleheads that were normally on the shelf had all been placed on the floor. They appeared to have been organised into a triangle with a jagged tail shape coming off of it. He simply assumed that Danny was messing with him, put his bobbleheads back up and didn't think too much of it. But Danny firmly told him he had never been in the room, that he didn't even have a key to get in. Back at their home, strange things had started to happen in Bill Sr. and Lee's bedroom. Lee was a deeply religious woman and had a small altar in her bedroom that she would pray to every evening. The most prominent object on this altar was a small statue of Jesus. One morning she awoke to find a pair of underpants placed on top of the Jesus statue. But that wasn't all. Over the following weeks, items would begin to appear in the room, such as watches, jewellery and a wallet. Upon inspecting the wallets, they realised these objects that kept appearing belonged to Danny, as if someone was sneaking them out of his home and into theirs. Obviously a little uncomfortable about having his valuables, they simply snuck them back into Danny's house without telling him, but they just kept reappearing in the bedroom. Then out of nowhere, Danny suddenly announced he would be leaving, giving the family just one day's notice before disappearing forever. When they entered the home after Danny had left, it seemed he had left a number of belongings behind. Oddly, they found on all the light switches strange symbols that they didn't recognise, drawn in crayon. Deborah was alone in a room which contained a shelf filled with a number of dog-shaped ornaments. She turned away for a brief moment. When she looked back, all the ornaments had been turned around, the dogs now facing the wall. She told her husband, but he didn't believe her, mocking her for such a ridiculous claim. The following day they entered the home again to find everything as they had left it, except for one thing. For some reason, the lamp that was in the bedroom was now placed directly in the centre of the living room floor. This, combined with the dog statues, led Deborah to be convinced that something paranormal was at play in the house. Out loud, she asked whatever it was to move something so they could see. But of course, nothing happened. However, they walked into the next room and realised that the dining room table had been dragged across the carpet from its original place. So again, Deborah tried again, this time being more specific and asking whatever was there to move a picture frame. But again, nothing happened. However, when the pair left the room and returned a few moments later, the picture was in a different place. The couple were genuinely shooken up by this, and Bill told his parents. While Lee was terrified by the idea, his father didn't seem to take the event seriously at all. Sometime later, Bill Jr. would rent the house out again, this time to a young couple named Tom and Michelle. The Moffitts, half jokingly, told the couple that they thought the house might be haunted, but they weren't bothered. A few months into living there, Deborah stepped outside one morning to find Michelle sat on the front step next door, looking upset. Deborah approached her and quickly saw the bruising around her face. Quietly, Michelle revealed that Tom had hit her. She stated that he had never done anything like this before, but ever since they moved into the house, he had changed, becoming more aggressive and violent. Just 1 week later, Michelle was gone. Deborah asked Tom where she was, but he claimed they had a huge argument and had broken up. He didn't reveal much more beyond that. Another week passed and Tom too was gone. The pair had just abandoned the house. When Bill Jr. went to inspect the property, he found it in perfect condition. But there was one oddity. One of the old rugs in the living room was missing. Just a few days passed when Deborah heard a knock at their door. When she answered it, there stood a strange man that she didn't recognise. He asked where Tom was, and Deborah informed him that she hadn't seen Tom in weeks. The man paused and said, "Did you hear what happened to Michelle?" Deborah asked him what he meant, and the man told her. Michelle had been found in a landfill, beaten to death, wrapped in a rug, before the man simply turned and left. Deborah, distraught, told her husband what the man had said, but he said there hadn't been anything in the news about any body being found. Seemingly, rather than informing the police about this, Bill Sr. was adamant they should just ignore it and not involve the police. Not long after this, the family decided to sell the 3 houses and instead move into another house together, not too far away. This apparent decision to move caused a sharp spike in the strange activity. Bill Sr. found a family picture on the wall turned backwards. Objects began moving around the house, and in some cases totally vanished. Nothing too serious until in 1987 the day of the move came. Deborah and Lee were alone in the house when they heard a loud bang coming from the kitchen. When they ran inside, they found the kitchen cupboards lying on the floor. It was as if they had been ripped off the walls. Shards of broken wood lay all around them. Then they heard the sounds of glass breaking. They rushed back to the bedroom to find all the windows broken. This cemented the family's decision that moving was the right thing to do, but it wouldn't be that simple. For the initial period of time they moved into their new home, nothing weird happened. That was until Bill Sr. once again noticed the family photo on the mantle was turned backwards. This simple turning of objects always seemed to signify the start of a sudden influx of activity. The family found themselves regularly being woken up in the middle of the night. The house's burglar alarms would be triggered by seemingly nothing. They would hear the sudden sounds of screaming coming from somewhere in the upstairs of the home. Other times they claimed they would hear their names being whispered by seemingly no one. And they would continue to find their belongings turned to face the walls. Then one day, Lee discovered a message written on the bathroom mirror in soap. It said, "Talk to me." This would be the start of the family's communication with whatever they were sharing their home with. At first they all assumed it was someone else in the family messing around, but everyone denied being behind it, thinking it would be a cruel trick to play considering they were all feeling a little on edge about the strange phenomena they were experiencing. Deborah removed the message and the family waited. After just a few minutes, a new message appeared, this time saying, "No escape." Messages continued throughout the following days, warning about dangers in the house like faulty wiring. Interestingly, most of these apparent dangers were located in the attic, as if it didn't want them to go up there. Weirdly, several of these messages featured the name Nini, a nickname that only Lee's long-deceased sister had used for her. The previous owner of the home, Bill Jr., had inherited. But then the next message just said, "Fools," as though the entity was mocking them for believing it was Lee's sister. The next day the message was a little more vicious. Written on the mirror was, "I hate Lee." Bill Sr., in a mixture of annoyance and fear, shouted out for the entity to tell them who it was. The next day the word Prince was scrawled on the mirror. Lee reached out to her local church to schedule a blessing. They had been hesitant to involve anyone else up until now, but the communication and apparent anger that was present had begun to really affect the family. But when the priest arrived at the home, he was visibly unnerved from the second he entered. He sprinkled holy water and said a blessing in the entranceway, but refused to go in any further. When the family asked did he not need to go and bless each individual room, he said that wouldn't be necessary, and quickly left. After this, the messages of hate and anger towards Lee intensified, including one simply saying, "Lee, die." Bill Jr. and Deborah were out at a friend's house one night. When they returned, they found a strange symbol drawn on the floor, a triangle with a jagged tail. The same shape Bill had found his collectibles in several years before. They soon realised that it had been drawn on the walls throughout the house, in a black charcoal-like substance. This symbol would continue to appear after that. Sometimes it would be carved into a wall with a knife. Others it would be sprayed across the floor in baby powder. Lee's altar was destroyed multiple times, including the head on her Jesus statue being broken off. Another night, Bill Sr. and Lee found their mattress torn to shreds. Terrified, they moved downstairs and began sharing a room with Bill Jr. and Deborah, leaving the upstairs totally empty. The angry messages towards Lee began appearing on walls as well as the mirror. Then her belongings started going missing, much like Danny's. The messages also began to mock her faith. The family began reading more and more on the paranormal, trying to find any help they could. Various investigators were invited to the home in an attempt to help the family, but the entity would simply mock the family in messages, telling them that no one could help them. After a team of psychics claimed that whatever was in the home was a powerful and ancient entity, the family began referring to it as Mr. Entity, rather than as Prince, as it had requested. seemingly to try and diminish its power over them. It did not like this. One day, Lee was sat at the kitchen table when she felt something sharp brush against her thigh. She jumped up to find a metal knife poking upwards through her chair. She had narrowly missed being stabbed by it. This became a regular thing, knives appearing in places that Lee would often sit or lay. Knives would be found pierced up through the stairs. Lee got into bed one night to find 6 knives just left in her bed. She was terrified, unsafe in her own home, afraid that around every corner danger may await her. But the family couldn't simply move. Whatever this was had followed them once already, and they had no reason to think that it wouldn't do it again. In fact, the entity was quite keen to demonstrate it could follow them wherever it wanted. If the family visited other places, objects from that place would appear in their home, as if the entity was showing them that it was following wherever they went. They would stay in hotels, and the symbols would appear carved into walls. It stole name tags from waitresses that served them in diners, almost presenting them to the family in a mocking way. Throughout 1988, strange noises would be heard through the house. The smell of feces would appear and disappear at random. Every time they thought they understood what Mr. Entity was capable of, he would change it up and do something new. Footsteps on the empty floor above them could be heard at all hours of the day and night, knocking from inside cupboards and walls, as though something was trapped inside. At times, booming laughter would be heard in areas of the house, and doors would slam shut all on their own. Then, it started to attract animals to the Moffitts. Flocks of birds began flying and squawking around their house, flying into the bedroom windows and killing themselves. The house began to be infested by rats. More chillingly though, the rats wouldn't run and hide when the family discovered them. They would just stare at the family, unafraid. The family was completely broken mentally. The one thread they seemed to be able to hold on to, however, was that this wasn't some unspeaking force. They could communicate with the entity. In fact, they could basically have conversations with it. And if they could communicate, maybe they could convince it to stop. The family began to see the mirror as a place they could communicate with Mr. Entity. And when Deborah asked at the mirror for the rats to leave, they did. But this communication didn't bring them much relief. Mr. Entity seemed to almost use these random acts of kindness as a further way to torment the Moffitts and keep them on edge. The family were becoming terrified, rarely leaving their bedroom at night, as that was when the activity was at its worst. The health of Bill Jr. began to decline as well, and it was getting to a point where they were genuinely becoming fearful for their lives. Bill Jr. and Deborah were still constantly trying to get help, but Bill Sr. only seemed to care when his property was being damaged. In fact, if Bill Sr. took the whole thing seriously, it seemed to change on a daily basis. One moment he was concerned for his wife and family, and deathly afraid. The next he would be acting like nothing was wrong at all. He was, however, constantly concerned about money, especially as Lee and Bill Jr. were increasingly spending money on supposed experts and paranormal investigators to come and inspect their home. At one point they invited 2 Native American shamans to come and cleanse the house. They were burning sage and wafting it around the upstairs rooms, but when they reached the attic, it was like the smoke was being pushed back, despite there being no apparent breeze. The 2 shamans and Deborah entered the attic. They began chanting and burning more sage in an attempt to get Mr. Entity to reveal himself. The attic began making strange creaking noises, and then Deborah became convinced that a face was forming in the insulation on the walls, creating a strange skull-like shape with horns where its ears should be. The face was taken in an increasingly vivid form, before falling to the floor and vanishing after just a minute or so. The shamans claimed that the entity was somehow living within Bill Sr., seemingly explaining his increasingly odd behaviour, but that they had successfully moved it from him into the family's pet dog. The only way to remove a spirit that has possessed someone is to apparently transfer it into another living creature. The dog passed away just days later of a previously undiagnosed illness, but the activity didn't wane. A paranormal investigator named Gary Kent, a man who had become integral to the Moffitt story, offered to move into the home to investigate what was going on more thoroughly. He instantly began provoking the entity, which quickly turned its attention away from Lee and towards Gary, throwing objects at him, shredding his clothes, and writing abusive messages that seemed to mostly attempt to humiliate Gary in a sexual tone. He too was attacked by knives, and then the activity took on a whole other level. One morning sat at breakfast, Deborah heard snipping noises, and then claimed that Gary's hair started falling to the floor. This was the final straw for Gary, who no longer felt safe in the house. He soon decided to leave. Shortly after this, mysterious water leaks in the house began, with no apparent source. This was around the time that the next pair of paranormal experts got involved, Ed and Lorraine Warren. Now, if you're someone who has an intense dislike of the infamous Warrens, then please bear with me. Their involvement in this one lasts for all of about 30 seconds, but it is important. As is to be expected, while investigating the home, Lorraine claimed that she could feel the presence of a powerful demon residing in the house. The following evening, the Warrens attempted to provoke the demon to reveal itself, much like the shamans had done. During the ritual, Bill Sr. began to act strangely, growling and howling, and moving in an odd manner towards Ed. He threatened to bite Ed's hand off in a voice that the family did not recognise. Ed stood his ground and Bill Sr. soon retreated to his seat, before acting like nothing had happened. Ed and Lorraine had seen enough and decided that the Moffitts needed an exorcism. However, when the Warrens got the church involved, a difference in the specific sects of Christianity that the Moffitts belonged to caused an argument between the family. They never went through with the exorcism. The Warrens said they were sorry, but if they weren't willing to work with the exorcist, then there was nothing more they could do. Strangely, I could not find any record of the Warrens ever speaking about this case publicly. Then the violence got very physical for the Moffitts. Lee was in the kitchen one day when she was pulled into the pantry by an unseen force, the door slamming shut behind her as she felt in the darkness a pair of hands gripping at her throat. Bill Jr. and Deborah rushed to help her, but it was as if the pantry door was locked. They finally pulled it open to find Lee laying on the floor in tears, with red marks around her neck. At this point, Bill and Deborah had given birth to their first child, and were terrified that Mr. Entity might move his attention to their baby. Deborah decided again to attempt to communicate with it, to leave them alone. It promised it wouldn't harm anyone else. It only wanted Lee. It claimed that Lee belonged to it. The entity then, through a series of messages, spoke about how a nun had been promised to it at a French monastery in the 1600s. But the monks who had been toying with satanic rituals didn't go through with the deal to sacrifice the nun to Mr. Entity after one had second thoughts and helped the nun escape. He believed that this nun was Lee in a previous life, and he had come to collect what he had been promised. The entity would communicate with Deborah regularly after this, but would never answer when she asked what exactly it was. Then the message Lee will die in 10 days appeared. On the 10th day, Lee was rushed to hospital with pneumonia and heart failure. Lee would be in hospital for weeks. While she was, the entity was barely heard from back at the house. But that didn't mean it was gone. Lee claimed that while she was in hospital, she would see a black shape moving around the room. She was convinced that this was Mr. Entity, although this black shape would often begin to take the form of an old woman, who looked like her mother, Dominica, the grandmother who died at the start of the strange encounter. Lee slowly recovered and was sent home, but was put on an oxygen tank. Soon after being home, however, the tubes were severed from the tank. The black shadow also seemingly followed her from the hospital. She saw it moving across the living room one night, contorting in shapes, slowly materializing a terrifying set of hollow eyes and a mouth as it moved in her direction, scaring her to such a degree that her heart nearly failed as she ran away from it. When she turned back, it was gone. One night, Bill Sr. woke up in the middle of the night after feeling something cold pressed against his leg. He pulled back the cover to discover what appeared to be some sort of spearhead that none of the family had ever seen before. The same night, the messages on the mirror told Deborah that Lee must be killed with this object. Deborah obviously refused, and much like had happened in the previous house, just after communicating with the entity, the glass in all the windows on the second floor shattered. Mr. Entity seemingly angry at Deborah's refusal to murder her mother-in-law. Two experts looked at the spearhead that they identified as a ritualistic tool used in the Congo, but that it looked weirdly brand new. At this point, Dr. Evelyn Paglini, a famous parapsychologist, got involved. The entity did not take kindly to her presence, again writing abusive messages, the most interesting of which said, "Fuck you. You lied to my family." Evelyn believed this was a reference to a sect of Satanism she had helped found years prior. Evelyn continued to work with the family, telling them to leave the upstairs empty, to give the entity somewhere to be contained. She began to believe that Bill Sr. was the one who has given the entity permission to stay with them, and that he was a big part of the source of its powers. Evelyn also believed that Mr. Entity was in fact a prince, specifically one of the 7 princes of hell, the most powerful of all demons. Evelyn encouraged them to almost work with the demon, to allow it to stay and to respect it, that it could potentially help them in some way if they stayed on its good side. But Lee refused as it went against her faith, plus there was the small fact that it wanted her dead, which I assume was a difficult thing to move past. When Evelyn left, the activity continued. Lee and Bill Sr.'s mattress would often be filled with water. Pictures of Lee would be found with knives protruding from them, or shredded into pieces. It continued to demand Lee's blood. Gary Kent got back in touch and asked to stay with them again. He had fallen on hard times and needed somewhere to stay, but also hoped he could again try to help the family. Once again, as soon as he did, the entity took great pleasure in focusing its attention on Gary. When Deborah questioned why it was so angry at Gary, it claimed that he was the one in a past life who had let the nun go. It would then say that it would gladly take Gary's blood instead, which obviously scared him away once more. Bill Sr. continued to act stranger and stranger, becoming unwell and spending most of his time alone, growing increasingly skinny. Lee would often find him sat up in bed in the middle of the night, talking to someone in a muttered voice. This was the point where Bill Sr. decided to start sleeping up in the long abandoned upstairs bedroom. One night the family found him in there, sleepwalking, howling like a wolf. When they woke him, he seemed completely normal, as though nothing had happened. the family finally approached an exorcist, who said he did not want to exorcise Bill Sr., but the house itself. Still, Bill Jr. was forced to restrain his father during the ritual. But the exorcist claimed that the entity that was present in the house was too powerful for him to remove. The family were convinced that rather than being a true exorcist, they had unfortunately just played into an expensive con. It soon became apparent that Bill Sr. had been communicating in the bathroom with the entity for quite some time, removing its responses before anyone could see. When Deborah asked what Bill Sr. had been talking to Mr. Entity about, the entity revealed that Bill Sr. wanted the entity to kill Lee. Deborah told Lee, who became convinced that Bill Sr. was only doing this to gain control of the large inheritance Lee had been left by her mother, which Bill did not have access to. Despite this, Lee was concerned about her husband's increasingly apparent mental issues. Lee convinced Bill Sr. to see a psychiatrist, and at one point he was taken in for a 2-week mental evaluation. During this time, Mr. Entity again seemed to leave the family alone. When they went to collect Bill Sr., he had convinced the doctors that Lee was responsible for making up Mr. Entity, and they then tried to force Lee to stay in the hospital herself, but she refused. The couple's relationship at this point was beyond saving, and Lee wanted him gone. Bill Sr. angrily packed a suitcase when he returned home and left. Over the following years, while strange occurrences did continue, the regularity and intensity was drastically diminished compared to when Bill Sr. had been in the home. Generally, the entity seemed more pleasant at times, even bringing the family gifts. That was until Gary Kent came to stay once again in 1992. The entity was enraged. At one point, Gary claims to have woken up to discover a shotgun laying in his bed. Gary, after the constant kindness the family had shown him in letting him stay when he needed to, told the family that he would be moving to England, as the demon had previously shown an interest in taking Gary's life instead of Lee's. He said he would take Mr. Entity with him, claiming that maybe this demon, or whatever it was, could somehow help the down-on-his-luck paranormal investigator. When Deborah suggested this to Mr. Entity, he wrote a string of abusive messages about Gary on the bathroom mirror. Deborah again attempted to make Mr. Entity leave, telling him that Bill Sr. was gone and wasn't coming back. There was no one here to give it the hate it seemingly so desperately needed. Mr. Entity asked, rather politely, to stay. By the time Gary came to leave, the entity seemingly changed its mind, claiming that Gary needed it. As Gary drove off for the airport, one last message was found on the mirror. It simply read, "Goodbye, my family." The family would never experience anything in the home again, but constantly lived in fear that it would come back. A very real fear that passed down to Deborah and Bill Jr.'s children, who didn't understand why their family seemed so on edge throughout their childhood. Bill Sr. and Lee divorced in 1994, and the family agreed to never speak about Mr. Entity again, through fear that acknowledging his presence may bring him back. Meanwhile in London, Gary would see the triangle with the tail carved in the wall of his home. But after some time, the entity just seemed to fade away. Shortly after this, the family lost contact with Gary forever. When Deborah's daughter found the photos that day, she spoke with her and her brothers about what had happened. Vague memories from their childhood suddenly began to make sense. The constant fear they witnessed from both their parents and grandmother as they grew up in the house. A constant feeling that something was wrong, but no one would talk about what it was. Now that the story was out, Deborah decided it was finally time to share it, and the family went public with what they had encountered for those years in their home. Jessica Moffitt wrote an article about her discovery for the Huffington Post. Deborah went on to Art Bell's Midnight in the Desert to talk about her experiences. 2 books have been written about the Moffitt family, but are annoyingly difficult to get hold of now, and it appears that Blumhouse has plans to create a series based on their encounters. But what really happened? There's a few elements to this story that feel a little off to me. While it certainly wouldn't explain everything that the Moffitts experienced, the idea of Bill Sr.'s seemingly worsening mental health throughout the years, his apparent desire for Lee to die so he could get her money, his accusations that Lee was mentally unfit, and that she was making up stories about a demon to make him seem crazy. The fact that Deborah found him with the same soap the demon was using for its messages on his hands. Of course, Deborah claimed that the soap was there because Bill had been wiping his secret communications with Mr. Entity off the mirror. But could Bill Sr. have been behind much of what the family experienced? Or could it have been less calculated? Was Bill Sr. a genuinely unwell man that was faking the entire thing? Of course, as always, maybe the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Is it possible that the family really did experience something paranormal, but that he was manipulating the events for his own personal gain? Could this explain the change in tone that Mr. Entity seemed to have? At times seemingly violent and unrelenting, and others reasonable and open to discussion. Another element that feels off for me is the involvement of the Warrens. Regardless of if you love or hate them, it's hard to deny they loved publicity. So why have they never spoken about this particular case, if they really were involved? If Mr. Entity was real, his backstory seems very inventive, and if he truly were a conscious being taking deliberate action, what exactly he was trying to do is cloudy and confusing, almost as though if he were real, it wasn't just a singular entity, as though there were different personalities attempting to break through. At this point, only Deborah Moffitt knows what truly took place over the course of those years between 1984 and 1992. Whatever the truth may be, the tale of Mr. Entity is one of the strangest and darkest I think I've come across so far. That's all for this entry into the tape library. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please consider subscribing and clicking like on the video. It's a really easy way for you to support the channel and help me to keep bringing you more terrifying tales. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget I now have a second channel called Night Drive that brings you even more true paranormal stories. You can find a link to that in the description. Thanks once again to Manta Sleep for sponsoring this episode, and thank you to you for listening right until the end. I've got so many great stories I want to cover over the next few months, so I best get to work now. Until next time, pleasant dreams.